enemy of NATO, why would we want our allies to be playing footsie and in fact dependent on them?
Yeah, he went after the fake news again today, but you just highlighted there saying that America pays 67% of the pot for NATO. He said today, again, that America pays 90%. He said during the press conference that other European leaders were going to up the amount of money that they're going to pay into the pot, and many of them have said, well, no, not past the commitments we've already made. Can you point to anything in his press conference yesterday that was actually factually correct?
Well, the fact that they've all committed to the 2%, maybe not the 4% that he had hoped for, perhaps that they're going to accelerate beyond the 2024 deadline. But, 67% of the NATO budget is not necessarily saying the same thing as the U.S.
It is a very, very busy hour here. I'm Becky Anderson in London. The US President is at Windsor Castle as we speak. We will return to our coverage of President Trump's visit here to the UK. Right now he is having tea with the Queen at her home in Windsor. That is Windsor Castle. The President and First Lady met the Queen a little earlier this hour. A guard of honour forming of the Coldstream Guards gave a royal salute and the US national anthem was played. In an interview, though, with the Sun newspaper, the President had praised Her Majesty, describing her as a tremendous woman who had avoided controversy during her 66-year reign. That was in stark contrast to the way that he described the Prime Minister Theresa May. We'll talk about that a little later. The Queen, of course, has met every US president since her reign began in 1952, with the sole exception of Lyndon B. Johnson, who didn't visit Britain during his time in office. I'm going to keep these pictures up. This was a little earlier on. Richard Fitzwilliams is a royal commentator and John Prideaux is the US editor at The Economist. And, I'm going to get you to commentate on what we've seen earlier on. But let's start off with our resident expert here, Richard. The Queen hanging on in the heat, it seemed, for the arrival of the US President and the First Lady. A lot of pomp, a lot of pageantry, and the US President will have liked that. The Queen has done this numerous times. I was going to say a few times before. Many times before.
Many times.
This is a first for US President Donald Trump.
Literally something he's always wanted, with his mother being a fervent monarchist. I think there's no question that this is something, again, that hopefully will, shall we say, improve his current feeling towards Britain as expressed, shall we say, in a press conference which was certainly not short and which involved a certain backtracking of an interview which he gave to the Sun, of which I think something one would say that the Queen, very, very safely one would say that she would personally strongly disapprove, but equally he wouldn't have an inkling of it. Very, very clearly the Queen would see her purpose now as to smooth things over. I mean, it's been said that the best way of persuading someone is when they don't know it's being done, and the idea now would be to make Donald and Melania Trump feel as at home at Windsor.
Perhaps one might call her a subtle genius, and that is certainly how Donald Trump refers to himself. He stood shoulder to shoulder. Yes, there's very stable and subtle genius. He stood shoulder to shoulder earlier on today with the UK Prime Minister, as Richard rightly pointed out, after what can only be described as a humiliating diatribe on the way that the Prime Minister has dealt with the exit from the EU. Effectively, he said she's wrecked Brexit. There will be no US deal, no deal, which he loves to say. Of course, this is the back end of this visit now. How would you rate his performance while he's been in the UK?
He did a very Trumpian, characteristically Trumpian thing, which was to say one thing when he arrived, criticise the Prime Minister for her handling of Brexit, say that there's no possibility of a US-UK free trade deal at the moment, praise Boris Johnson, her rival in the Conservative Party. Those three things are about as unhelpful as he could possibly have been to his host. And then in the press conference really say completely the opposite. Say, oh, I'll work with you, whatever the outcome, praise Prime Minister May. He talked about the special relationship, this lovely phrase. He said, it's the highest level of special, which I enjoyed very much. So as a kind of Trump commentator or analyst, you're left with, well, which of these completely contradictory statements do you take seriously? And it's not clear to me. I mean, I think if you took the first half of the visit, it would have been seen as a disaster for the British government. After tea with the Queen, after that press conference, I think they'll be able to say, hey, phew, we got out of that alive.
Which I wonder, he may be very relieved by the fact that he perhaps has got away with this trip, because the next one now is building up to be quite something. Richard, forgive us while we just go and talk Russia for the time being. We'll get back to the royal family, because literally in the last hour we have heard that the Mueller investigation is now indicting 12 Russian intelligence officials for interfering in, effectively conspiring to meddle in the 2016 campaign. The Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who announced this news, specifically said there is no allegation in this indictment that any American citizen committed a crime, which I think we should probably clearly assume was a suggestion that nobody, neither Trump nor anybody in Trump's coterie who is an American citizen was involved, correct?
That feels right to me, Becky. We also don't yet know where these GRU intelligence agents are based. I suspect they're probably based in Russia. Therefore, this indictment, it's not exactly theoretical. I mean, they won't be able to come to America anytime soon. But the idea that the Russian state will suddenly hand them over to the DOJ for prosecution is clearly fancy.
But this news coming literally just hours before the president leaves here. He's got a couple of days golfing in Scotland, but after that he's got a one-on-one, the first official one-on-one with the Russian president, who has always denied any interference in the 2016 campaign. Trump himself has called it a witch hunt and a hoax. He promised reporters, when asked today at the press conference, he promised that he would ask again, but he almost did it with a sort of rolling of his eyes. I'm sort of paraphrasing his eyes to a certain extent here, but he said, I'll ask again, but I don't expect to get a kind of, a big sort of, I think he called it a Perry Mason moment out of Vladimir Putin. And then, not moments after we find out about these indictments, we find out that the source of the Novichok poisoning, of the latest death in the UK, has been found. UK, US, lots of pressure on the Russians, it seems.
Yeah, a lot of pressure on the Russians. I mean, too much news really to process. It feels like an overdose of news. I mean, going forward to this Helsinki meeting on Monday, normally in anticipation of something like that, both sides, the Russian side and the American side, will be working for weeks on kind of deliverables, trying to very carefully manage the message. From the American side, how are we going to work on nuclear proliferation? How are we going to work on Russian election interference? What about the, murder on British soil of, a British citizen by Russia? All the briefing has been that, so far, that from the American side at least, that preparation hasn't taken place. So we don't really know what's going to happen going in there. The president, as you say, was asked about this during the press conference. He said it relates to Ukraine, nuclear weapons, hacking, a few other things, but we really don't know whether he will. I think it's not too conspiracy-minded to see the news that's been released both now from the DOJ and from the British police as, trying to really remind the president before Monday that Vladimir Putin is an adversary.
And Rod Rosenstein suggesting that President Trump was informed about these allegations, he said earlier this week.
Right. I mean, so if that's the case, why release it now? There is a venerable tradition in America of releasing news on a Friday. People are thinking about what they're going to be doing at the weekend. You kind of bury the news somewhat. But the timing does seem deeply weird just before the president's due to fly to Helsinki.
Well, present, as we speak, is at Windsor. Richard, this is the Queen's residence off times at the weekend, a residence that she likes outside of London, of course. So the kick-off to her weekend has been entertaining the US President and his wife for tea.
And this is a time he talked about a lack of controversy. Well, this is one occasion.
This is a new image, by the way. This has just come up, Richard. This is an image inside Windsor Castle, and certainly the US President, big smile on his face.
Yes, and we're also seeing them behave, because there's a certain protocol with meetings to the Queen. The way, for example, you bow, the way that she extends her hand, the way that she begins conversation, and so forth. And there's no question that I think it's probably a big moment for him, and I think also, hopefully, she will be able to convey very thoughtfully, very quietly, some ideas and thoughts that even in the mad whirlpool which consists of the Trumpian world, he might wish to consider perhaps at a quiet moment.
This isn't a state visit. This is known as this has been slugged a working visit. Did Queen Elizabeth II have to offer this invitation to tea?
There's absolutely no doubt that whereas originally, as you know, Theresa May very, very rashly, just after the inauguration, then she said a state visit. Now, this would have only been the third ever, because there have been a large number of American presidents, of course, since 1920 with President Woodrow Wilson, but only George W. Bush and Barack Obama had a state visit. This was offered. He believed that he'd in fact stay at Buckingham Palace with all the pageantry and the panoply. In point of fact, it would have been absolutely and totally impractical given the feeling against him, and given also the policies and the reprehensible aspects of some of them. But this at least was something that had to happen, because you couldn't have the President of the United States, Britain's premier ally, visit and not be received by the